Hey guys, today we learn how to win Rook Endgames with an outside and extra passed pawn. After watching this video you will understand the plans and will be able to win in most of these endgames in your own games. Keep watching. The first thing we need to understand in these endgames is how important is the position of the rook here, because it's not the same when we have the rook behind the pawn as when we have the rook in front of the pawn. Usually we're going to say for rook endgames that the best position for the rook is going to be behind the pawn, either whether you are the strong or the weak side. So we'll analyze two examples about how to win these endgames. In the first one, the rook of the strong side will be behind the pawn, which is good. In the second example, the rook of the strong side will be in front of the pawn, which is a little more complicated, but still it's going to be winning for the strong side. So Alekhine is playing as white, and Capablanca is playing as black. This game is from World Championship in 1927. Here Alekhine has an extra outside passed pawn, and also he has the rook behind the pawn, so it looks like he has some good chances to win this endgame. However, black king is also very active, so it's not going to be so easy. The plan Alekhine will try in the next moves is to bring the king towards b5 to be able to push the pawn. So let's see what happens. He's playing here king d3, and Capablanca plays king d5, king c3, king c5, taking no position, controlling the squares, so the king cannot make too much progress in this move. Rook a2, just making a tempo. Remember the rook cannot move, and then king b5, and then king b3. This is an interesting moment here because the pawn is hanging on a5. So Capablanca is playing king c5 here, but I think it's really interesting what happens in the line where black accepts the pawn on a5. There will be a simplification, and then white king is a little bit closer to black pawns, so black needs to come back very quickly, and actually they can get in time to the king side, and after this position anyone could say this is going to be a draw. However, there is a big difference between white and black here, and it is the activity of the kings. White king is way more active, which means that if we can create some weaknesses, if we can disconnect these pawns, then white is going to be able to win. So the plan to win here is f4 and then f5. Here black needs to capture, king takes, then king e7, and then king g5. Once we capture this, white has an extra pawn, and the endgame will be won more or less easily. So black plays here king c5, and then king c3, and then king b5 again, and then Alekhine says, I want to make progress here, so I play king d4 here. The rook comes to d6, and now Capablanca is going to change the blocker. The blocker will be in the next moves the king, and he will defend the pawns on the king side with the rook. So king e5, rook e6, king e4, and king a6. Now white makes some progress with the king, and black changes the position of the rook now over f5. So king a6, and then rook to f5, defending, but also attacking here. So it looks like an interesting plan. The game continues with f4, and black is playing here rook c5. The rook comes to a3 to make sure the pawn on g3 is very well protected. Rook c7, and then king g7, attacking the base of all these pawns. Black makes a tempo with rook d7, and then this move, f5. And the idea is one more time to disconnect these pawns to create weaknesses, so the king could be able to capture them. So after f5, g takes f5, and then king h6. f4, g takes f4, the rook comes to d5 to defend that pawn, and the king comes to g7, attacking the other isolated pawn on f7. Rook to f5, defending, attacking on f4, but then the other rook comes to a4, defending from the side. King comes to b5, and the rook comes to e4, which seems to be on protecting this pawn, but if black takes it, then there will be a trade of rooks. So king takes, rook e5, simply fine, and this is winning because after rook takes, the king is taking and the pawn is promoting. So of course black doesn't take in this position, and Capablanca is playing king a6 here. The king comes to h6, rook takes a5, and then this move rook e5, interfering the rook over the 5th rank. One more time, there is a big difference between white pieces and black pieces. White pieces are very active and really close to black pawns, as black pieces are away, so they won't be able to help too much in this position. So rook a1 and king takes pawn. What is going to happen is that black is going to lose the 2 pawns, and then white is going to be winning with these pawns over here. The rook comes to u1, the rook comes to g5 after rook h1, now rook f5, finally getting that pawn on f7. King f6, rook takes f7, king comes to c6, and then an important move, rook e7. This is a typical technique in Rook Endgames. We want to cut off the king, make sure the king is not coming, it's not going to be helping, and this is going to be winning. Here Capablanca resigned. The second example is from a game between Lerner and Dorfman, and this time we have an outside passed pawn, but the rook is in front of the pawn, which is not ideal. However, something good is that the king is a little more active and black king is a little more passive. Let's see what happened in this game. Here white is playing a5, there is a check, the king comes to e5, the rook comes to a3. Usually in these endgames, the strong side, we try to move the king towards the queen side to support the pawn and to be able to move the rook and finally promote. And when this happens, the weak side should try to get some of the pawns on the king side, and later, in general, the rook is going to be sacrificed over the passed pawn, and what will happen is that there will be a race between some passed pawn over here and the king guarding that passed pawn, and the king and the rook, which will be over there maybe, and they will try to come back very soon. And usually this transposes to that kind of endgames with king and rook for the strong side against king and passed pawn for the weak side, and that's exactly what is going to happen in this one. So white plays here king e4. The plan is to go over there, but they want to make sure they protect the pawn as long as possible. And black is playing rook a4, and finally the king comes to d5. Rook a3 again, and the pawn advances now to the 6th rank. The rook takes the pawn on f3, and then the rook comes to b8. Another important note about this endgame is that in general the strong side won't push the pawn to the 7th rank unless they see they are winning in a forced way. The idea is that very often we want to use that square to cover the king from the checks of the rook. So if we play a7, then there will be many vertical checks with the rook, and white king won't have a place to hide. So it's going to be more or less easy to get a draw if that happens. So the move white is playing here is rook b8, and the idea is that he's planning rook b6, king b7, and then pushing. That's the plan. So the rook comes back to a3 because there is a threat, a7, a8. So the rook has to come back, and the rook comes to b6 now. Rook takes pawn, and king c6, rook a3, and then king b7. This is the plan we were saying. Black plays here g5, and the idea is that they want to work already on the pawn majority they have on the king side. They need to rush because the passed pawn here is going to be decisive in the final result of this endgame. So h takes g5, and then h4. White plays here a7, and black is going to play here a3. At this point we promote to get the queen. Notice that the move here, rook a6 interfering, is not really going to work since black is playing h2 and they're promoting with check. So even if we take the rook, they promote, that's check, and it's not really going to work. So a8 promoting to queen, the rook takes the queen, the king takes the rook, and the pawn comes to h2. It seems like white is winning very easily with this move, rook h6. However, there is a small surprise here from black. Black can play here f6. If the rook takes, black is promoting. If the pawn takes, black is taking the rook. So f6 is a really nice move. White needs to capture that pawn on h2, and then the pawn takes on g5. And this is what we were saying. Very often, those endgames with an outside passed pawn transposed to king and rook versus king and pawn. And this position is very special. Here, black wants to advance very quickly the king and the pawn to force white to sacrifice the rook for the pawn and finally get a draw. And on the other side, white will try to bring the king very quickly to be able to, using the rook and the king connected, coordinated, stop the pawn and finally win the endgame. However, at this point, there is only one move that wins for white. I will say it right now, the move is really hard to find, but also it's very instructive. And the only move that wins here is the surprising rook f2. The idea is that when we bring our king, if black king is over this side of the pawn, the king will be hindering our king from advancing. So we want to make sure black king will have to go over the other side, and then our king has a free way over here to get really fast over this area of the board. So just to show you one line, if instead of playing rook f2, white plays here something normal like king b7, then the king comes to f6, and after king c6, black doesn't come over here, black comes over here, over e5. This is what Boresky would call shouldering in his books, and the idea is that now the king cannot advance, so the king has to go to c5 maybe, but then g4, and then maybe rook h8, going over the backside, but then g3, rook g8, king f4, king d4, then king f3. After king d3 we advance, and after king here we advance with the king, and then we are promoting. This is going to be a draw. So we need to play rook f2 here to avoid the shouldering maneuver with black king, and then black comes to h6, the king comes to b7, then g4, then king c6, then king g5, and we continue advancing. After g3 the rook comes back, after king g4, then king e4. Everything is different now because no one is stopping our king from advancing, so this is good. And at this point black is going to resign. The problem is that after, for example, g2 we check, and after the king moves we advance, and now this is going to be winning for white. So in these endgames, with the rook behind the pawn, activate your king, and usually there will be some good chances to win the endgame. With the rook in front of the pawn, it's going to be a little more complicated. Get ready to probably sacrifice some pawn on the king side, so your king goes to the queen side and you guard your pawn over there. Get ready to some transposition to king and rook versus king and pawn, and a race in that endgame. It's going to be certainly hard to win, but there are some options, even more if you have studied the position before. Question: do you feel more confident now playing these endgames? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you want to learn the endgame rook and 4 versus rook and 3 on the same side of the board, make sure you check that video up there, and there will be a lot of information about that ending. Thank you, like and subscribe. See you in the next.